I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kids Straight Mom. Today, we are going to talk about media effects, specifically framing, and how the right-wing media uses them to create a link between LGBTQ plus rights and the left's alleged desire to hurt children.
Because mom started a master's degree, and so she's fancy now.
Super fancy. In the case of outlets like Fox News, certain topics are always framed in the same way. Critical race theory is prejudiced, DEI is unfair, gender identity is made up, etc. Because their audience has these same frames hammered into their minds every time they read or watch Fox News, that affects not only their attitudes about the topic, but their thought processes as well. I realize our audience might not need this little lesson, but I think it's helpful to have these ways of explaining this because you may at some point need to explain to someone why the article or information they're giving you shouldn't just be taken as objective, unbiased truth. It just feels like some of these concepts are helpful for being able to say, here's the problem with that piece of information. The reasons that right-wing media has for doing this with LGBTQ plus issues are obvious. Conservatives embrace traditional family values, by which they mean traditional gender roles. So any topic framed as a threat to families and or children will create an applicability effect in conservative audiences. By that, I mean it creates a way of interpreting information that affects the audience's future thinking about that topic. So, for example, if DEI is framed as unfair and dangerous, the audience internalizes that and then will support anti-DEI laws and politicians. As an example of this kind of media framing, I'm using a couple of articles from Fox News' sports site Outkick.
I did not process that when I read that article. That's actually a Fox News subsidiary?
They own it. Yeah.
I was like, oh, yeah, just some random right-wing blog, I guess. Whatever. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's owned by Fox News. Now you have that context. These articles are related to a National Institute of Health study on transgender athletes and gender-affirming care that Nike is allegedly helping fund. We don't know if they are or not. For background, I have to tell you about a New York Times article by Jason Engerly published on April 20th. This is where this all started. That New York Times article, How the War Over Trans Athletes Tore a Volleyball Team Apart, is about a transgender college volleyball player, Blair Fleming, who was outed by an online magazine and became the target of a lawsuit by teammates and a lot of vitriol from anti-trans activists. So this New York Times article quotes Joanna Harper, who is a leading researcher of trans athletes at Oregon Health and Science University. She's helping with a study of trans adolescents that measures their results on a 10-step fitness test before they start hormone therapy and then after they've begun to medically transition every 6 months or 5 years. The researchers want to find out how retained male advantages actually affect athletes, how and in what sports. Harper is quoted as saying that Nike is helping fund the study. We've talked in the past about New York Times having its own questionable framing issues regarding trans people in the past, but this is all about Outkick and Fox News today. Outkick, the sports news website owned by the Fox Corporation, according to New York Times, ran more than 50 articles about Fleming and San Jose State over the course of the season. That amount of coverage alone is what's called agenda setting, where the media agenda directly influences the public agenda. As we all know at this point, the issue of trans women playing in sports has blown up in the public consciousness, and a lot of politicians campaigned on it in 2024. So, just this media attention made it really forefront in people's minds.
Which, by the way, I think we would say that, like San Jose State was doing well, but they're like a mid-level D1 program. It's not like they were, Caitlin Clark, Iowa in the basketball tournament or something like that. There was no real reason for this mid-level D1 volleyball program to be getting this much attention based on how they were performing.
Right.
Despite the fact that she had been on the team for a couple years already and not been dominant at all.
Right.
She magically became dominant when people found out that she was transgender. That's how that works.
Pretty much. Outkick, so like I just said, agenda setting there. Like they're making this topic something that people are thinking about. But they're going beyond that into framing. To quickly define framing, it's the choices media use and how to present what issues and how those particular presentations affect the attitudes, thoughts, and eventually, according to research, sometimes even voting behavior of the audience. Framing exists everywhere in the media, and it's not inherently meant to confuse or mislead the audience. Simply covering a political race as a contest or highlighting one effect of a policy over another are examples of framing.
Sorry if I can jump in. A totally normal and non-sinister example from sports, right, is that if you're a sports reporter, you're going to come up with two versions of your story before the game even happens, right? Like if it's a kind of David versus Goliath game, you're going to have one story where, oh, well, Goliath won. So, it's a team that was living up to the high expectations that they had set for themselves the entire season. Whereas if David wins, it's a yes, David has beat the mighty Goliath, right? So you're taking these two different outcomes and you're applying a different frame to them because they're going to create, even though it's the same story, you're framing it differently for the audience to make it interesting to them.
Right. Yeah, it's a technique. It's not always bad.
It's fundamentally necessary for journalism because otherwise you're just all over the place.
Right. However, some media outlets intentionally use framing explicitly to create a roadmap of processing and reacting to political and social issues. And that's where framing becomes a vehicle for misinformation. The first Outkick article, published on April 22nd, 2 days after the New York Times article came out, by Dan Zakshishki, is titled, "Nike Won't Say If It Is Funding Child Transgender Athlete Study, but Evidence Suggests It Is." Okay, so starting with the title alone, this has the tone of a conspiracy, right? The article then refers to Harper as, quote, "a biological male who identifies as a woman and purportedly studies transgender athletes." So while Harper's gender identity, and she is transgender, has nothing to do with her credibility, the misgendering and the use of purportedly about her qualifications immediately frame the NIH study as duplicitous and unscientific.
This is all very kind of funny, by the way, because if you actually read the article, because, again, she is a leading researcher in the field. She's been behind a lot of the research that has been done, including, I think, one that was maybe she was actually in the research that was done for the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, or maybe she just commented on it. But she's done a ton of research on this. And if you actually examine all the various papers she's put out, it's not like she's, kind of doing some kind of stamp of approval on a blank check for trans athletes to participate, right? She's, she has put out papers that have very kind of complicated findings saying, transgender women might have an advantage in this area, but not in this area. We want to see how these straightforward measures of strength or fitness end up translating into the more complicated dynamic of an actual sporting event. Like, she is not just going, yes, trans people in all the sports with no regulations whatsoever. And anyone who actually looks at even the titles of her papers will see that.
If you actually read the information, you know all of this. If you depend on Outkick's framing, you get a completely different impression because they absolutely are presenting this as a trying to rubber stamp what they want the research to say kind of a thing. So then this article asks the audience, why is a sports apparel company allegedly funding research that focuses on children and young teenagers taking potentially life-altering medications simply to try and prove that males should be allowed in girls' and women's sports? Basic common sense tells us they shouldn't. I mean, we can answer that question.
I'm a big fan of the specific phrase life-altering. Yes, you know what is life-altering? Antidepressants, chemotherapy, anything that saves your life.
Right.
Anything that improves your life.
Yep. So, they have to make it sound really threatening. And also, the answer to the question, why would Nike be supporting this, is if your concern about transgender athletes is truly fairness in sports, you want as much data as possible on how prepubescent gender-affirming care affects strength and athletic performance later on. You want this information.
If your concern is making sure that cisgender female athletes are not having their opportunities to compete in sports taken away from them, then you would want to know, do transgender women have an advantage in athletics? Do transgender women who started medical interventions before puberty have an advantage? If not, the problem shouldn't really exist, should it?
Exactly.
Maybe you're right. Maybe you have some stuff to talk about. But when you actively are saying that, no, we don't want this research to be done, that makes it seem like maybe it's actually not so much about the protecting the cis women at all.
Yeah, because they continue, quote, why is Nike so invested in seeing what happens to prepubescent children when they are given potentially harmful and life-altering medications, hormones, and surgeries? This is a company that constantly preaches about women's sports and how dedicated it is to supporting women, yet they are allegedly helping to fund a study to see just how much medication male children need to fairly compete in women's sports, end quote. Instead of presenting the research as what it is, which is the scientific gathering of data to learn more about something, Outkick wants the audience to think of research as inherently biased, existing only to find an excuse to carry out a nefarious agenda. Not only are puberty blockers questionable at this point in the framing, but so is science in general.
Well, I mean, they're really framing it, yeah, as this sinister, like, these children are nothing but lab rats who are being experimented on without their consent, which it's a study on children who would have been going through these medical interventions regardless. Very different from how much estrogen do we need to give a teenager to make her compete at the same level as cisgender? That's not what's
That's
happening.
not what's happening. So their closing of this piece is, quote, it appears they want a study that says if doctors stop young males from going through puberty with pharmaceutical intervention and transition them as early as possible, there's no reason they shouldn't be allowed to compete in girls' and women's sports. And if that study is produced, what is the end game? To have as many little boys as possible put on puberty blockers and hormones in a rush to head off puberty? How is it possible that more people don't realize how insane that sounds? If this is true, shame on those researchers and shame on Nike. The company would be participating in experiments on kids that our society should qualify as child abuse. Truly disgusting. End
I agree.
quote.
What are they imagining is the goal here?
Right, because, from an objective point of view, the protect women's sports crowd should welcome this research, as we said, right? If there are, as they claim, inherent physical properties that make men faster, stronger, more athletic than women, regardless of hormonal interventions, because that's what they think, they should be excited for the study to prove that. Instead, Outkick frames this study from the beginning as biased, quote, disgusting, abusive, and existing for the purpose of getting as many boys as possible on puberty blockers. As if it's like trying to convince boys to do this.
Right. Well, and here's the thing. This doesn't, because presumably their argument is it's unfair because these boys will transition to take over girls' sports and have an unfair advantage. But if they're admitting that prepubescent intervention would eliminate their advantage, which seems to be the logic of saying that they're advocating for prepubescent intervention because it makes them not have the advantages, then they wouldn't have the advantage. So who wins here?
Yeah. And I mean, the fact is, the scientific community has a process. They have ethics, rules, peer reviews, because research studies are about answering questions, not trying to achieve an agenda. The conspiratorial framing of this article creates this impression that the scientific community is trying to lure kids into gender affirming care and that Nike is inexplicably in on this. But there's more. So remember how I said framing works because the frame is introduced and then repeated, so it gains importance in the audience's thought process? The following day, April 26th, Outkick published this: A Look Back at Nike's Greatest Woke Hits by Bobby Barek. Barek tells the audience that consumers control the marketplace, and just as Bud Light and Target faced consequences for, quote, using their influence to celebrate transgenderism, Nike should be made to suffer for their alleged funding of this study. This piece veers even further into misinformation, while continuing to frame the study as nefarious. It quotes right-wing personality Tommy Lahren as saying, "It's abusive to give children puberty blockers. Why that ever became a thing to me is so disgusting and reprehensible." So, puberty blockers were approved in 1993 by the FDA and have been used for decades to treat things like precocious puberty, endometriosis, and other medical conditions. They're endorsed by many medical societies and are recognized as being potentially life-saving among transgender youth at high risk for depression. The medical community acknowledges that these are safe treatments, and they're not always used, even if that's your objection, they're not even always used for transgender kids.
Certainly concerns about, long-term use. If someone's on puberty blockers for a long time with no hormonal replacement, that can be problematic, but that's not what again, there could be legitimate medical concern about the improper use of these therapies, and turning it into using them at all ever is abuse.
Right. After this baseless opinion by Lahren, Barack proceeds to list all the times Nike, quote, has used its influence to make a political or social statement that disregards at least half the country, end quote. Of course, no reference is given for what data might have given Barack this impression, but that doesn't stop him from casually presenting it as fact. His list includes multiple misleading statements. In talking about Colin Kaepernick's activism, he says, "These days, Kaepernick is flipping back and forth between likening the NFL to a slave auction and begging for another chance to play." His ridiculing of Kaepernick, I think, is supposed to imply that the Kaepernick ad was a huge mistake on Nike's part. In actuality, PBS reported in 2019 that following the Kaepernick ad campaign, Nike's annual sales jumped 7% to more than $39 billion. And Nike CEO Mark Parker said that Kaepernick campaign inspired record engagement with the brand, an important goal for the company. So, although Nike has seen their sales drop more recently, like working with Kaepernick wasn't a source of that. In talking about Nike's support of racial reckoning after George Floyd's death, he said, quote, "In fact, the racial reckoning was hijacked by BLM leaders who enriched themselves based on the lie that Black people are not safe here in America. Nike helped enable that lie," end quote.
A really interesting thing that happens, I think, and I'm sure it happens in left-wing media as well, but I see it a lot in right-wing media, where they throw out these references to things like, you know, a transgender woman smashing a cisgender boxer's jaw into multiple pieces. And they don't ever actually give you any kind of receipt or link to what they're talking about or actual statistics or videos or literally anything, because the people that they're talking to, that they're writing for, have already had this idea sort of implanted in their head that that's what happened. And it's enough of a warped representation of reality that they can't actually provide any actual evidence of what they're talking about, but they know that the people that they're writing for will understand. Yes, there have been accusations of financial mismanagement of the Black Lives Matter, as an organization. Okay. And then you bundle that together with the outrageous lie that Black people are unsafe. And it's just, yeah,
Right.
it's just so disingenuous.
Black people are more likely to be treated unfairly by the justice system, which, by the way, according to a 2019 Pew Research Center poll, 61% of white people believed that to be true. People know this is the case. And health disparities mean Black people are also at risk for worse outcomes from similar conditions than white people. It is less safe to be a Black person in America.
You just look at maternal and infant mortality rates. This is one that I mentioned when I was discussing this with someone who was arguing that actually there's no need for any kind of civil rights movement for Black people anymore because racism is gone now. But I mean, yeah, you look at maternal and infant mortality rates, and the disparity there is really, really significant. And it's one of those things that, how do you explain that without acknowledging systemic racism?
Right. But no, it's all just a big lie, according to Outkick. He also lists them supporting the U.S. women's team on their fight for pay equity. He doesn't say why this is a problem. And Nike's equality campaign. Those are both. He doesn't really explain why. They're just obviously, they're very woke.
This is a great example, by the way, of someone who's so very concerned about women being treated fairly and transgender women destroying women's sports. but also not wanting women to get equally compensated for their labor.
Uh-huh. I know, exactly. These two pieces from Outkick are a 1-2 punch of anti-science, anti-transgender, anti-wokeness framing meant to convince their audience to fear gender-affirming care and be angry at Nike, hoping for a practical result of a Nike boycott and political backlash toward Nike, gender-affirming care, and transgender rights. So using these framing techniques as a vessel for misleading or outright false information is effective and dangerous. The results of misinformation and its resistance to corrections are actually described in a really informative article from the Journal of Nature Reviews Psychology in 2022, which I will obviously link to all of this on our website.
Because we cite our sources.
Because
here
we cite
on
our
Weird
sources.
Kid Straight Mom.
Yes, we do. Because of various cognitive and social forces, misinformation leaves a lasting effect on people's reasoning, even after correction. This is called the continued influence effect. These changes in not just attitude, but thought frames not only allow misinformation to affect citizen competence, but they give biased media an outsized influence on our societal priorities and elections. You know, this technique is closely tied, I think, to misinformation because it's a really effective vehicle for providing it, because once you've created this frame of something as dangerous and you've opened people's minds to that, then, it's just really easy to pour in. And like you said, like there's this image that's already been created in their minds. Even coming into these articles, right? Fox News and their subsidiaries, like they've had this steady, continuous, consistent framing of this issue in a certain way that means you will absorb this information without a lot of interest into whether it's true, right? Not a critical eye, not care that there are no sources provided, because your way of thinking about this issue has been shaped by a media outlet. So again, the reason I wanted to give that little lesson is just that I think once you know those things and you see how those things are working, I feel like gives us a better language to use when we ask questions. So where did that information come from? And do they ever describe a different side of it on that channel or in that magazine? Or, just being able to ask those questions of people. And then if they're consistently always presenting it in this way, should that make you question their motives? There's a lot of media literacy that comes into play in this, and I think it's particularly low. I actually saw, Sienna, that your generation, Gen Z, is the most gullible generation. And part of that has to do with just general distrust. But there's really, and I'll link to that article too, but it was in Politico, but that your generation, your cohort, not yours specifically, because you are quite good at this, but a lot of people are not very good at knowing how to determine what misinformation is or what a good source is. Very open to conspiracy theories as well.
I think this is also a really good example, though, of how it doesn't have to be misinformation in order to sort of promote a particular narrative, whether it's about trans people or any other group or issue. Because broadly speaking, Fox News is kind of in a position where most of what they report is probably true in that a thing happened that they are describing. They've veered more and more towards, active misinformation, I think, in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
But if you click on a Fox News story, there's a good chance that the core thing, again, that core kind of grain of sand in the big old misinformation pearl is real. But it's that framing thing. It's the way that, that you prime an audience to interpret a particular issue, and the people you get to comment on a story, and all of these little things that might not actively be lies, but that are presenting the truth in such a distorted way that it leads to people having opinions and ideas that don't reflect reality.
Exactly. That's why I thought this was such a good example is, yes, it's true. There's this study that's happening. And at least this researcher did say that Nike was helping to fund it. So whether that's, I mean, I don't know if that is true, but like it might be. So it is exactly like you said, precisely the framing that they use in talking about this thing that is true, that is really happening, that create this impression. So Googling it, I found just all these right-wing sources that are like in such outrage about Nike funding like these experiments on kids.
Well, and I think it also has a little bit of like an effect of shifting the journalistic Overton window, like the Overton window being the idea that if there's pressure from one side and you have like one side dragging things in a more extreme direction, what's considered normal will shift further in that direction. And so, we talked a bit about these New York Times articles. And I remember I was reading over one of these articles that was talking about trans athletes, and it was the article about the International Olympic Committee having commissioned a study to look at whether transgender women had an advantage. And it was discussing, examples of transgender athletes at an Olympic level. And it was like, transgender domination in the Olympics has been variable. For instance, there's this one transgender woman who didn't do very well at all. However, there's also this soccer player, Quinn, who's non binary and plays on the Canadian women's team and led them to winning the gold medal. Quinn is a non binary soccer player who is assigned female. They are not on any kind of masculinizing hormone therapy or anything. Using them as an example of trans people doing well in the Olympics is really misleading. But I think the problem is that like this Overton window has shifted in the way that you cover transgender sports so that, it's relatively common to see people covering it in that outkick way. And so to seem moderate on the issue, you have to have there's truth to both sides, even when there's actively no truth.
Right.
Like there are no examples of transgender women dominating competition at the Olympics. So they effectively like invented an example, and they said in the article that, Quinn is assigned female, but the very fact that they used them as an example is so misleading.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the ways that the New York Times, when I said that, we've had conversations about that, because we did, that one episode specifically about a piece that was in the New York Times, and it was an opinion piece. But I think that they're a good example of it's not misinformation, but their framing sometimes is like maybe what you're saying, maybe the whole like we have to cover both sides equally. Everybody has a legitimate point of view. Like maybe that's a form of framing, right?
Right. And the problem is that what is considered a legitimate point of view on one side of the issue has gotten pulled so far in one direction that you have to treat that as a legitimate point of view to be viewed as like normal and mainstream and covering everyone equally.
Yeah. It's interesting stuff. The media has a lot of control. The more you understand, I think that just makes us better at being educated consumers of information and maybe learning how to ask like really quality questions of people that present us with information.
Right. And I want to be really clear because I think people tend to look at stuff like this and say, "Oh, well all of the press is just lying to you and trying to control what you think." And that's like as we've established, there is very much a spectrum from groups that will just straight up make things up to groups that will kind of wrap the truth up in all of these misleading claims to papers like the New York Times that are telling you the truth in a relatively unbiased way, but will still sometimes frame things in a problematic way to try to maintain their sense of neutrality. Like press is like the media and press is a spectrum and a continuum. And so it doesn't mean that, you have to never believe anything that the media says, because I think that's equally problematic. I think that's actually why my generation probably is so media illiterate, is because a lot of people just don't trust anything any source says, no matter how reliable the source might be.
Right. I mean, that's a good point. And just because a certain media outlet is going to frame something from a certain point of view, as long as you're aware of that, it doesn't mean that it's bad information. It's not. I mean, like, we obviously are going to frame LGBTQ plus issues as important human rights issues on this show, right? Like, that that's where we're coming from. But we're also very careful to not say things that aren't true and to provide our sources and to fact check ourselves. So,
Right. So, like, I think an example would be online newspapers and magazines like Them and LGBTQ Nation, right? Where if you just look at the headlines, you're probably going to get a really inflamed perspective on whatever they're talking about. But if you click on the link, like, it's well researched articles that link to all the various sources and stuff, and like you're going to come away from that article knowing that the things that they're talking about actually happened.
yeah.
From a media literacy perspective, I think what's just really important is, you can make sure that the source that you're looking at is not falling into that they just straight up make things up camp. There are plenty of online fact checkers, Snopes, and all sorts of stuff like that that'll just give you a good idea of whether a source is sort of basically reliable in that way. And then beyond that, like, yeah, just read critically.
Yeah. I mean, my policy is kind of that even if I see something that, like, oh, this is going to happen, Donald Trump's getting thrown in jail, even if it's something that, like, I'd be happy to see, if it sounds like, wait, what? I always look for, like, multiple sources because usually it's just one sort of out there. Cause I mean, they exist on the left and the right, these sites that, like, it's all about clicks. It's all about just getting people to, like, consume their information, right? For ad revenue and all of that stuff. Whether it makes you mad or makes you happy, if it sounds like a little implausible or like, is that really happening? Like, just make sure you can find, like, a variety of sources that are saying that it is happening. Because usually you'll find out that, like, if it's, like, really over the top, that it's just one.
The real tragedy is that in the last few months, there are all of these things where you see someone posting about how, a US congressman has introduced a bill to rename Greenland red, white, and blue land. And you're like, there's no way that's true. And then 2 days later, you see it in the Washington Post.
Yeah. Media studies in the future on this time will be fascinating because there's plenty of, well, that can't be true. Oh, huh, okay. And not a lot of it is good, at least from our perspective. We would not frame it as good news. So hopefully this has been helpful. As always, questions, comments are welcome. On our next episode, we are going to talk about Pope Francis as the world is mourning his loss. We just wanted to talk about, although it was imperfect and many wanted more, he reached out to the LGBTQ plus community in ways that have not been seen from that position before. And, that has been meaningful to a lot of people. And so we're just going to talk about how that fits in to the Catholic doctrine, how he felt that outreach was important to his ministry. And we are going to have a guest that is going to talk about that with us. How you can be a devoted Catholic who is well versed in Catholic doctrine and still see recognizing LGBTQ plus people as dignified human beings who deserve care and rights and respect that can all coexist together. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram and Threads at queerkid.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at Queer Kid Straight Mom. We are no longer on Twitter.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.